Okay, hi everyone. Rhodey, I'm going to just go ahead and hand over to you to start rather than having me talk. I think that's what we would normally do. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Great. Matt will tell us when you can start. I think probably now. Matt?
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you and to our noted speakers, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm grateful to Kimberly Stanton for arranging this important briefing and to Matt McLaughlin for managing the tech side. My name is Rhodey Margerson. I cover international humanitarian policy for the Congressional Research Service, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel today. This briefing focuses on a timely and complex issue regarding protection issues in Afghanistan amid the evolving humanitarian crisis unfolding inside the country and potentially in the region. We will shortly hear brief presentations from our panelists. This will be followed by Q&A, where we plan to allow ample time for your questions and discussion. Please only use the Q&A function to type your questions. I will just provide some brief context before introducing the panelists. As someone who's been to Afghanistan several times, I have observed firsthand some of the humanitarian challenges as they have evolved over time. And I want to highlight some main points. First, today, the situation on the ground is fluid and continues to evolve by the hour and by the day. There is a lot we do not know. Second, prior to the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan already faced a multi-layered, ongoing and severe humanitarian crisis affecting 18.4 million people out of an estimated population of around 35 million. Humanitarian needs are expected to rise significantly. Conflict and natural disasters, most recently drought conditions, have driven ongoing humanitarian needs, resulting in chronic vulnerability among the general population. In 2021, for example, an estimated 1/3 of the population was facing emergency and crisis levels of food insecurity. Escalating conflict in recent months has resulted in increasing numbers of trauma injuries among Afghans. Protection concerns also include systemic violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law by the Taliban and other armed groups, and range from deliberate attacks on health and education facilities to targeted killings and the forced recruitment of children as child soldiers. My third point is that for decades, Afghans have endured a protracted displacement crisis, with Afghans displaced within their country as internally displaced persons or IDPs, or outside the country as refugees. Estimates suggest that there are close to 5 million IDPs and 2.6 million refugees. Some Afghans have been displaced as refugees for 40 years. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, and other humanitarian organizations are preparing refugee-receiving countries, specifically Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, for potential new Afghan refugee arrivals. The status of border closures with neighboring countries continues to fluctuate, and there's reportedly some movement back and forth across borders, but no large-scale international displacement from Afghanistan at the moment. Fourth, the COVID-19 pandemic and worsening conflict exacerbated the humanitarian situation with immediate and secondary impacts that resulted in near doubling the number of people requiring assistance in the last year. And fifth, finally, current conditions could further constrain humanitarian efforts, hinder assistance delivery, and present risks to the safety of humanitarian personnel. The United Nations and other organizations have confirmed their commitment to stay, deliver assistance, and support the humanitarian response in Afghanistan, but the international staff footprint could shift depending on security. According to the United Nations, for humanitarian organizations, protection is typically about advocating for and supporting actions that aim to reduce and prevent people's exposure to risks and to ensure respect for the rights of individuals by those responsible in accordance with international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law. Our panel today will help us understand the significant protection concerns in Afghanistan and provide examples of ways that humanitarian actors are responding. Let me now introduce our three experts. We are very fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from these individuals, all of whom are working in and well familiar with the situation in Afghanistan. You have detailed bios in hand in your program, so very briefly, I'm pleased to welcome our speakers in this order. Vicky Aiken is the Country Director for IRC Afghanistan, a position she has held since 2017. Before joining IRC, Ms. Aiken served as Country Director for GOAL in Syria, Sudan, South Sudan, and Sierra Leone. Prior to GOAL, Vicky worked with the United Methodist Committee on Relief and Health Alliance International in Sudan. Astrid Sletten is the Afghanistan Country Director for the Norwegian Refugee Council, a position she has held since July 2020. Prior to this post, Astrid was NRC's roving Country Director, where she was deployed to Iraq, Nigeria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and Ethiopia. Astrid has more than 19 years of experience in humanitarian emergencies and development work in 13 different countries. Finally, Jared Rowell is the Country Director for the Danish Refugee Council in Afghanistan. As one of the largest humanitarian aid agencies in Afghanistan, DRC works in the sectors of emergency response, protection, early economic recovery, and mine action. Prior to arriving in Afghanistan in 2018, Mr. Rowell was the regional manager for South and East Asia at Mercy Corps, covering a total of 11 countries. Again, a warm welcome to you all. We look forward to your questions and ask you to hold them to the end of the presentations. I will now turn things over to Vicky Aiken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in this meeting today. A lot of focus and attention has been placed on evacuating at-risk Afghans. And while I applaud these efforts, evacuation will only be available to a tiny fraction of the population of Afghanistan. More than 40 million Afghans will remain in Afghanistan, and half of them already face critical humanitarian needs. I'm here to talk about those Afghans and what we need to do to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. More than 90% of Afghans currently live on less than $2 a day. When I arrived in Afghanistan 4 years ago, this number was roughly 50% of the population. The devastating impacts of the 2018 drought, COVID, and the 2021 drought, along with an escalation in the conflict, caused that number to skyrocket. And now, without a functional government in place, with the threat of sanctions and the withdrawal of development funds, the current prognosis is quite dire. Humanitarian agencies, many of whom, like IRC, have been working in Afghanistan for decades, including during the previous Taliban regime, are determined to stay and deliver. More than 99% of IRC's staff are Afghan, and 40% of those women. Some are trying to evacuate, most are scared, but many, if not most, are ready to resume operations and want to help their own people despite their fears. I have had female Afghan staff take their names off of evacuation lists because they are so concerned about the people within their country. In the words of one of my child protection staff, in the crisis we face in Afghanistan, it is good that we save our lives and our families. But what will happen with the millions of children that cannot leave Afghanistan? My heart is broken for the children of Afghanistan, and I volunteer to stay and provide them a protective space. My staff are the bravest people I know. NGOs and UN agencies have engaged the Taliban for years through the Joint Operating Principles, which clearly explain what we can and cannot do based on the humanitarian principles of independence, neutrality, impartiality, and humanity. We have successfully operated under these terms in Taliban-held areas. We harbor no illusions that continuing to do this will be easy. My colleagues will provide more information on how it will be possible, but aid should not be contingent upon the regime under which people live. To reach as many people as possible inside of Afghanistan and to do it safely and in a principled manner, we need support. And this support includes the following: continued diplomatic engagement, particularly productive engagement to protect the rights of women and girls and the safety of humanitarian workers. Without our female staff, we cannot reach half of the population. Increased humanitarian funding that is flexible. As noted, the lack of a functional government right now and in the disappearance of development funding will increase the burden on humanitarian agencies to prevent a humanitarian disaster. And finally, we need exemption for humanitarian actors as well as humanitarian supplies from any current and future sanctions. Thank you very much. And I will now hand over to my colleague from NRC, Astrid.
Thank you, Vicky. I would like to add a few points on stay and deliver. Humanitarian NGOs are committed to stay and deliver impartial humanitarian assistance and protection to millions of people in need. Right now, we have hit the pause button on our operations while we seek clarity from Taliban on how to move forward, but we hope to resume our activities very soon. NRC began working in Afghanistan in 2003 and operates across 16 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. Our team includes more than 1,600 Afghan and 28 non-citizen staff. In addition, we have approximately 400 community-based working teachers. Our staff are implementing our core competencies across Afghanistan: education, shelter, information counseling, legal assistance, WASH, livelihood, and food security, plus camp coordination and camp management, as well as integrated protection and advocacy. We are committed to the humanitarian principles, and our position as a neutral, independent humanitarian organization that delivers impartial assistance is critical to our ability to engage with authorities and manage humanitarian access, including in areas under Taliban control, which, as we know, basically is the entire country. In order to continue to meet humanitarian needs, immediate action is needed to assure the continuity to financial access. ATMs in Afghanistan and no hawala and banks are closed, makes it difficult to continue our humanitarian operations. So the NGOs needs to explore alternative arrangements just to be able to pay salary to our staff. As the Taliban takes on greater governance role, we need clear safeguards to make basic transactions like processing and transferring of funds, payment of taxes, tolls, and other fees, and import duties, and the purchase or receipt of permits, licenses, public utility services, and telecommunication. Regarding sanctions safeguards, the US must ensure that any sanctions or counterterrorism measures comply with international humanitarian and human rights law and do not impede impartial humanitarian activities. Impartial humanitarian activities should be excluded from the scope of sanctions and counterterrorism measures. The overwhelming urgency of the crisis in Afghanistan requires quick action by the administration to issue OFAC general licenses in Afghanistan to mitigate the risk that the delivery of aid to those in need is not delayed or prevented. International humanitarian law prohibits acts of terror, and humanitarian organizations recognizes the rights of member states to take measures to ensure the security of their people. However, if not implemented carefully, such measures can impede the provision of humanitarian protection and assistance. Humanitarian NGOs employ safeguards to assure that foreign assistance dollars do not fall into the wrong hands, including funds from USG, the American public, and other donors. While the Taliban hasn't been declared IFTO, the urgent need for life-saving services necessitate a similar timeline and scope to what is seen in Yemen, especially as the administration and Congress consider measures to limit the Taliban's access to international funding streams. Strong guidance from Treasury alongside a general license is also important to safeguard and protect vital access to financing for humanitarian actors and to reduce bank de-risking. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Jared from DRC.
Thank you, Astrid, and thank you, Vicky, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for taking the time to hear us speak about Afghanistan, a topic very important to all of us. So I will be specifically focusing on topics related to humanitarian access and bureaucratic access impediments. So DRC is committed to staying and delivering, but like other humanitarian organizations, we cannot and will not implement programs in an unprincipled manner, as it would put staff and affected communities at risk. Ensuring safe, principled, unimpeded, and timely access is vital to continued humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. And this applies to all parties, including the international community and humanitarian actors on the ground. A clear common approach to humanitarian access and bureaucratic impediments is key to ensuring all NGOs can continue their work. The humanitarian access landscape has shifted drastically in the past few weeks, but there are opportunities and there are areas for improvement. There are opportunities to influence the development of policies in a way in which is conducive to principled delivery of humanitarian assistance. But there's unlikely to be any quick answers on these issues, as the Taliban are still developing their own internal policies while facing resistance and conflict in various parts of the country. They're also attempting to develop a transitional unity government during this time. But it is vital that donors, including the United States government, continue to support NGOs, including supporting a conducive access environment that is not overly restrictive and prioritizes the needs of the people of Afghanistan over politics and any potential sanctions. It is DRC's position that unrestricted sanctions at this time would only negatively impact the people of Afghanistan. NGOs have committed to abide by a set of joint operating principles, which have been updated to reflect the current reality on the ground. These principles are the foundation for promotion of access and to address bureaucratic impediments. So NGOs are the main implementers of projects, meaning we face the most pressure on the ground during the delivery of assistance. To reduce our exposure and the risk to our staff, the NGO community is relying on clear and strong UN leadership for facilitating discussions on difficult issues. The UN must continue to take on the responsibility for pushing for safe, unimpeded, and principled access, which NGOs can then reinforce in our own messaging, but we cannot do that alone. And one of the most pressing issues is the topic of female staff. They are a vital part of the humanitarian response to ensure that we reach the entire target population, especially women and children. While some provinces are approving a more inclusive approach to allowing female staff to work, it must be a blanket acceptance across the country and not just limited to certain places and/or activities. The humanitarian community needs to be unified on this issue. In many provinces, the current refusal to allow female staff is causing delays to resumption of activities, yet organizations are facing increasing pressure to resume those activities. The treatment and allowance of female staff is also a test case for how women will be treated more broadly in the country. Failure to ensure their right to continue working is a negative indicator for women's rights in general. The Taliban is in the process of developing standard operating procedures for NGOs, which are expected to come out in the coming weeks. This will be a critical document in understanding how the access situation will unfold in Afghanistan. There is and needs to continue to be high-level strategic advocacy on this document before it is finalized to ensure that it is in line with principled humanitarian access and action. NGOs also need assurances from the Taliban on the safety of our staff, our assets, and our facilities from both the political unit of the Taliban and the military unit, clearly in writing and disseminated across the country to all of their actors. NGOs also require operational independence. There must be clear red lines on non-interference of assessments and assurances that the Taliban will not tamper with our beneficiary selection or demanding confidential data such as beneficiary or staff lists. Now, when it comes to bureaucratic access impediments, it's unclear to which the extent this will improve or worsen in the near future, as many government departments are not yet fully reopened. And there's also going to be a major gap in qualified staff due to so many leaving the country. So we do anticipate a lot of challenges from a bureaucratic access perspective. Visas, work permits, registrations, MOUs are all key functions for NGOs to continue operations, but there are indications that NGOs will need to renew or obtain new versions of those documents, which will cause delays in our response. It's also unclear at this time if the Taliban is going to demand taxation or other financial demands that NGOs will need to provide for those documentation. The UN is also in the process of establishing an air bridge, which will generously allow NGOs to access getting in and out of the country. But we need to ensure that visas in neighboring countries are quick to facilitate and that essential commodities are also able to enter into the country without bureaucratic delays. Finally, I'd just like to add that access and bureaucratic access impediments are deeply interlinked to the safety and promotion of our staff on the ground. DRC Afghanistan's national staff, of which there are over 700, are some of the bravest and hardest working people I know. They faced tremendous pressure in the last few weeks. They lived in fear for their families and their own personal security. But even during that time, they were organizing money and food drives for the influx of internally displaced people into Kabul city in order to give water, food, blankets, other non-food items to people living in parks and warehouses or out in the open. Most recently, they began another money drive to help support people to return to their provinces if they wanted to go home, now that the large-scale conflict has subsided for the time being. And they're deeply committed people. It's imperative to me personally that we protect them as much as possible. And humanitarian access principles are going to be the main facilitator of their personal safety and security as they continue to work. So these issues are very relevant to the day-to-day lives of our staff. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to the facilitator.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for these interesting and very compelling remarks and for making yourselves available today. I know the situation there is very demanding, and we really appreciate you taking the time, but also being willing to share with us your views. I would like to just recognize that Representative Jackson Lee and Representative Bilirakis are both here and attending this session, and they are members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and their attendance is greatly appreciated. I think we'll start. I will go ahead and ask a question, and then we can open it up to the Q&A with the general audience. I know that you have made some recommendations in your remarks, but if you have further recommendations that you would like to now put on the table, so that we can hear we've heard how difficult the situation is and the problems that you're encountering. What are some of the recommendations you would have for this audience? Thank you.
So I can quickly start. But in addition to what I've outlined in my presentation, I would also just advocate for as much open borders as possible. And that includes with neighboring countries. So the border points are still largely closed. Access to Pakistan is currently restricted. There's some commercial traffic coming in and out. But Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran are also currently very restrictive. and other countries are currently assessing to various degrees how many people or Afghans are going to be taking in over the next few weeks and months. I would just encourage as much as possible open flows of people and migration, because we need to ensure that people are able to leave safely if they're in fear for their lives or in fear for their own personal security, including their families. There is a desire amongst a fair number of my staff to leave the country. I'm certainly not trying to stop that or get in the way. I'm trying to facilitate to the greatest extent possible what I can support. But that also requires the cooperation of a number of different governments. And so I hope that as they see the humanitarian needs increase, that all people have certain degree of self-determination in terms of whether they choose to leave the country or not. So thank you.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists have a comment they would like to make on this?
Yes, I would like to add that in the face of rising needs, urgent funding is required to allow aid agencies to save lives. The need for assistance is increased at the same time as threats to civilians is at an all-time high. Current level of international humanitarian aid to Afghanistan are insufficient to ensure independent and needs-based humanitarian assistance. More than halfway through this calendar year, the UN Humanitarian Response Plan for Afghanistan has received only 38% funding for the year, jeopardizing life-saving aid. US humanitarian funding has remained flat despite the doubling in needs in Afghanistan this year. Donors are also urged to fast-track funding to allow NGOs and partners to meet urgent humanitarian needs. And for that to happen, we need a certain level of flexibility. In example, in NRC, we have a large program providing legal aid and counseling to people on housing, land, and property and other legal issues. And something tells me that that program will not be so relevant going forward. So we would like to redirect funding from programs we have to park to more life-saving, urgent humanitarian programming. Thank you.
And if I could just add, I do want to ask everybody on this call to not forget about the people inside of Afghanistan. I know that almost all of the media attention and efforts right now, rightly so, are for those that need to get out, but there are 40 million people in Afghanistan, and they are in critical need of food, of water, of protection. And we cannot lose our focus, and we cannot disengage diplomatically, because in order for us to operate inside of Afghanistan, we need diplomatic support and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Allow me to add one more thing. Also, when the last planes leave the airport of the evacuation efforts, remember there will be thousands of people in real need for protection, and they should be allowed safe passage to another country, in example, neighboring country, if they so wish.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn things over to Representative Bilirakis, who I understand has a question. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Great, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for all your great work. The stories and images that I've heard and seen come out of Afghanistan over the past few weeks have been really, truly heartbreaking. And I know you all agree. The courage and commitment of the NGO workers on the ground is inspiring. I thank you for all your commitments and all your work and your compassion on behalf of the people of Afghanistan, and of course the American citizens as well. Again, quite frankly, You are the lifeline for millions of Afghans, and we appreciate it so very much. You truly understand the reality on the ground, and I know this is extremely informative for at least to me, but other members of Congress who are listening as well. As a member of Congress, I want to know from you exactly what the U.S. Congress can do to help you make difficult conditions a little bit better, a little bit easier. I know you touched on this, but if you'd like to elaborate, and whoever would like to go first, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we start with Vicky?
Sure. Thank you very much for your support. You know, as mentioned, Congress can help ensure that there is funding available for NGOs to do humanitarian work. They can ensure that any sanctions that get imposed that NGOs are exempted from those sanctions, and that we are able to continue to provide assistance. It's who is running the country right now has nothing to do with the majority of people inside of Afghanistan, has nothing to do with half the population that are women and children that had no say in this, and that are suffering right now. They're suffering from the drought, they're suffering from the conflict, they're suffering from COVID, and we need to be able to provide them assistance. And, you know, I implore you to ensure that the diplomatic community stays engaged. Anything that Congress can do to put pressure on the executive branch to stay engaged diplomatically, we would greatly appreciate that, because our staff need support. They're feeling like the world has abandoned them, and that after August 31st, no one will care. And I know that's not true. I'm an American myself. I know my people care. And so we really encourage you to stay engaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Can I ask a question, another question with regard to, you mentioned the NGOs are going to stay on the ground, obviously. What's the percentage of folks, American citizens, that would prefer to leave and come back to the States that you work with? Anyone want to answer that?
Go ahead, Jared.
No, Vic, you're as an American NGO, I think you should go first, and then I can answer. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I know I'm an American citizen, and I'm preferring to stay in Kabul and work with my team here. I don't, you know, I know of other American citizens that work with NGOs that do want to be able to come back if they have left to work with their staff, and do plan on doing that. And what we need to support that is the commercial flights to resume, and for the humanitarian air bridge that the UN is running to get up and functioning. But as far as American citizens that are here and that want to leave, I do know that the embassy is reaching out to all American citizens. I know I get calls in the middle of the night asking if I want to leave. So I do know that that is functioning, and that they should be able to leave if they want to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I don't want to take up too much time because I know there are other members, so I'll yell back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Bilrakis. Very much appreciate it. Let's now turn to the Q&A, and I will just start with a question. Do you think the Taliban will be more or less hostile to international assistance NGOs than the Ghani government, which was in the process of creating a very restrictive NGO registration taxation process to limit NGO freedoms in Afghanistan?
So I'd love to start by answering that, because I think it's a really good, excellent question, and very perceptive around what was the operating environment for NGOs, particularly in the past year. It is correct, the Ghani administration, particularly certain high-level offices and ministries, created a very hostile, challenging operating environment for the NGO community. In the past year alone, they attempted to completely redraft the NGO law, which had been in place for the past 15 years, and to put in clauses that completely violated independence, neutrality of NGOs to work in Afghanistan. There were clear red lines that were being violated, and there were clear attempts by the administration to push that through executive orders. And it was only due to the active engagement of the US government, the European Union, and others that helped stop the flow of that law being passed. Additionally, back in January, there was a vice presidential decree that no new projects could be approved without explicit approval at the vice president's office. And that was being managed by one person for all of the NGOs and all of the projects. So the idea was basically to create a backlog that would make it nearly impossible for NGOs to work. Yes, it has been very, very challenging for NGOs to operate that way. That being said, it's still very unclear if the Taliban will proceed in similar ways or if they're going to operate with more transparency and in good faith with NGOs. It's too soon to tell. What I would say is that if they want legitimacy, which is what they are claiming, and if they want to be perceived as a legitimate state actor, then they have to operate in good faith with the NGO community, because we're the backbone of providing essential services throughout the country. So I do think that they understand that there needs to be a more good faith process, but whether they follow through on that or not, it's still early days.
I fully concur.
Thank you. Go ahead, Astrid.
I fully concur with Jared, and I would like to say that it's hard to imagine that we would have more bureaucratic impediments under anyone, including Taliban. I do think we have a moment now, an opportunity to actually influence Taliban while they're making these rules and regulations that will govern. So I want to say that we are leaning on the UN to take the lead and ensure that NGO voices are also heard.
Great, thank you. Vicky, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess it will depend on if there are any carrots offered, which we can't do. I mean, they will be relying on us to provide services, but if sanctions are applied immediately, they may lose any incentive to play ball with us.
Thank you. We have a question from Representative Jackson Lee, and I will now turn over the floor to her. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Can I be heard?
Yes,
Hello?
we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so very much. I join my colleague and thanking you all so very much. I have been to Afghanistan many times, and certainly in the very early years of the Afghan-US war, starting in 2002, and founded and chaired the Afghanistan caucus in the House of Representatives. We owe a great debt of gratitude to all of you. And certainly I think one of the most salient points is the fact that there are 40 million people in Afghanistan. 40 million, even as, excuse me, even as we evacuate thousands, there are 40 million. So I'd like to get from the NGOs the absolute sincere response on what the US leaving means as relates to NGOs. And the capability of the Taliban to be able to govern with a sense of letting the NGOs work. And I have a concluding question of what is the level of COVID and the need for medical teams to come in? And lastly, the threat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda as relates to the work that you have to do. Will the Taliban ensure that you can do your work outside of these potential threats? Sorry for the length of the questions, but I think these are important elements for Congress to know and understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to start on this, please?
I can start, Rodi.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for all your work on Afghanistan over the years. We really appreciate that. Where to start? So if the US leaves completely, and if it removes the diplomatic community as well, we have relied, as Jared has mentioned and Astrid, on the diplomatic community to be able to help us make the government understand what we need to do our work. So without the support of the US, the previous government may have implemented an NGO law that would have made it impossible for us to implement anything in the country. We're relying on diplomatic support to ensure that our female staff can continue to work. We're doing independent negotiations as well, but we need to have a functioning government to interact with, and the diplomatic community has provided a lot of backup support to us over the years. In terms of COVID has been raging in the country as there's no death registry, so we can't say how many people have died of COVID. I do know that 4 of my own staff have died of COVID. I do know that Afghanistan only has enough vaccine for 9% of the population. I do know that in this current regime, if women are forced to stay at home and not access healthcare, that could be highly problematic, particularly when it comes to COVID. We do know that gender-based violence has increased dramatically since COVID started. Many of the health facilities, the health system is run by NGOs contracted through the government. What is going to happen to that as development funds have been frozen? How are they going to be able to continue their work? It will be the same with education. If the government doesn't have any funds, how are the schools going to operate? There may be more need for informal schooling through NGOs. In terms of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, our programs in certain provinces have been impacted by ISIS over the years. I have lost staff by ISK attacks as well. We've never been able to negotiate with them. They don't care about the community. I know the Taliban has been fighting against them in certain areas, so it is yet to be seen how the Taliban is going to interact with them. And at that, I will hand over to one of my colleagues.
Thank you.
Jared or Astrid, would you like to add anything to this, please?
It's hard to follow such a comprehensive reply, but I would like to remind the audience that Afghanistan was hard hit with the COVID pandemic before this current crisis, and that people have already exhausted whatever limited resources they had when the economy and the population was hit with the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just add as well that I think it's less about sending in people and support to respond to COVID and more about vaccines and certain resources, financial or otherwise, to help support the response that is happening on the ground. And there has been increased capacity in terms of testing facilities and health facilities that have been trained to better deal with this than compared to the first wave. I also think that it's not just about the ramifications of the illness itself with COVID. It's about all of the additional vulnerabilities that have arisen as a result of COVID. So when a lot of people were confined to their homes, we saw a lot of evidence of increased gender-based violence, increased child abuse, increased domestic violence, other types of protection-related issues. And that is something like an organization such as DRC and the others here would also focus on. Since DRC is not a health agency in Afghanistan, but so we try to focus on those types of needs as well. And I agree with everything that's been said about ISK and others. I just think that they're really in a strong position to serve as a spoiler in the country. There's a lot of ways that they can act very opportunistically in order to create problems. And my big concern is anything that would impact the ability for people, aid workers, citizens, otherwise, to get in and out of the country. And I think that that's something that needs to be paid careful attention to. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Jackson-Lee, do you have any follow-up or any other questions you would like to ask?
I didn't hear him on this last sentence.
Okay, Jared, could you just repeat your last question,
Sure.
last response, sorry.
Yeah, just to say that there really is an opportunity for, another armed opposition group like ISIS to act as a spoiler in the country and to do something very specific that would create a huge set of problems for both Afghan citizens, aid workers, otherwise. And that is, I think, a huge concern at the moment. And anything that would prevent people from getting in and out would create even more problems than what we're currently seeing. So they have the capacity to do that. And that's something I think that should be monitored.
Thank you. Representative Jackson-Lee, could you hear and do you have any other follow-up questions that you would like to ask?
I didn't hear that. Or can you hear me? I didn't hear with coming weeks or months from the United States for medical issues, including COVID.
Okay, thank you. You're fading in and out a little bit, but I think I got your comment. Thank you. At this point, I think we will move on to some other questions. I encourage you, if you have not already put a question in the Q&A, and if you would like to have one answered, that you please do so. I'm going to turn to a question now that is, appreciate the need for funding support to the response to needs in Afghanistan. However, your panel has just shared many of the barriers to funding and ongoing support. How can you ensure the funding you are requesting will be able to be spent, given the concerns around Taliban support for ongoing philanthropic work? And I will turn it over to Astrid. Do you want to go ahead and then we'll follow on?
I think at the moment, we need to realize that Taliban needs some time to sort of configure its setup in Afghanistan. And for NRC, we are realizing that we need to park some programs that are a little bit contested, perhaps, and focus on emergency response. Basically go for the low-hanging fruits that will, on the one hand, save lives, and on the other hand, create a level of acceptance with Taliban. In NRC, we are planning to do winterization and wash activities because it benefits men, women, children, alike. Unfortunately, shelter activities, even if it is durable tents, is quite expensive when it's done in a large scale. So we are going to call on all our donors to contribute to a proper winterization program this year so that we prevent more suffering. So I think that answers the question partially, but we will have to negotiate and try to influence the process of these guidelines and rules and regulations that will govern how we work going forward.
Just to add on, to add on to what Astrid said, as she had mentioned in her opening remarks, the Humanitarian Response Fund is only 38% funded. There are activities that can go on and that haven't been done yet either. And that plan was made before this summer happened and all of the additional requirements. So right now, WFP is still delivering food. So activities can continue. We're expecting the pause to be a matter of weeks, not a matter of months or years. We are foreseeing a dramatic rise in the need for education in emergency as schools may be unable to open. It is predicted that 50% of children in Afghanistan could have acute malnutrition. We need to immediately address that before they get into severe malnutrition. So I don't think that there will be a problem spending any additional funds that are sent to Afghanistan.
Jared, did you want to add anything?
Just very quickly, I would just say that NGOs, particularly the three on this call, have a lot of experience also monitoring the way money is spent on the ground. And there are a lot of safeguards and protocols to ensure that the money is going to where it's supposed to go. And we have those systems in place. So there are no significant changes in the past few weeks, which would cause me additional concern about how we track and spend our money appropriately to our donors and to the U.S. government, anyone. We have those structures. So I think that that's something to be aware of as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. We'll now turn to another question. Now that the Taliban have taken control of Kabul, do you anticipate wide-scale returns? Also, is the Taliban likely to force people to return? What will be the main humanitarian and protection needs if people do return?
I'll quickly start. I
Sure.
think at this point in time, I anecdotally do not get the impression that there are wide-scale returns being planned. We are seeing, I think, a small number from Pakistan specifically willing to cross back over the border in order to get back home because they do see a degree of stability. But that is fairly anecdotal, and I don't think it's indicative of the wider desire for people to come back now that widespread conflict has subsided for now. I think it's very much more of a wait and see game. But for those that return, I do think that it's the general pattern of vulnerabilities that we always see for returnees, particularly around legal right issues. The need for people to have national identification in order to access certain services provided by agencies, land right issues, people being able to have entitlements to their homes, and that's particularly necessary for women. So I do think some of those protection vulnerabilities are going to still be there, but nothing new or unique to this context.
If I may add, let's not forget that several 100,000, if not millions, have fled drought. And the reason they fled is that their fields are dwindling, their livestock are dying, and there are no livelihoods opportunities. They're seeking refuge in cities and towns and living from hand to mouth. These are still a population in high need, and the humanitarian community needs to continue to address these needs.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this? Okay, I'd like to just read a comment from Cindy Buell, who is the co-chair in McGovern's office. And she says, I think these presentations highlight how careful the US and international community needs to be if looking at financial restrictions, sanctions, etc. on Afghanistan, and ensure they do not place additional obstacles in the way of humanitarian programs operating inside Afghanistan or ordinary Afghan survival. I'd like to ask each of you to just briefly comment and add anything to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my colleagues have mentioned a general OFAC license would be much welcomed for the humanitarian community in Afghanistan. Even now, for goods coming across the border with the Taliban collecting customs, people are questioning, can we buy these goods? Can we distribute these goods? Already with COVID, so humanitarian goods were getting even more restricted in our ability to get them. So if you add sanctions on top of that, the ability to get medicine into the country, the ability for food in the markets, many things becomes extremely difficult to program sometimes with sanctions in place. And when you're talking about a humanitarian disaster like Afghanistan currently is, we need to be able to operate quickly and flexibly. And again, by maintaining our humanitarian principles and the joint operating principles to ensure that there isn't a diversion, but sanctions could crush a people that are already being crushed.
Yes, it is incredibly frustrating to be on the ground, have staff ready to resume work after this week of drama, but to have to pause because we need clarity. I mean, we risk setting a trend that will be hard to bounce back from. There's more questions than answers for the moment. And as a non-UN citizen, I'm, for example, wondering what arguments to use to push back on income taxes. We paid income taxes for international and national staff alike for the Ghana government. What would be our arguments? These are types of questions that we are asking ourselves these days.
I think just very quickly, the comment that was made reminded me of a meeting I had 2 years ago with the US government donor representative who asked me, well, if you're distributing cash in a government-controlled area to people in need, how can you ensure to me that if they go home to their village controlled by the Taliban, they're not spending the cash there in the marketplace and it won't end up in the hands of the Taliban? And there's really no justifiable way to answer that in a way that will satisfy those types of questions. And so I think we need to shift away from those types of concerns, because the reality are that goods and services and money need to flow in the country. And it can't be a bureaucratic burden to track where every single dollar is going to be spent once you hand out the aid to those beneficiaries. A new reality has set in. There's very new power dynamics and people in control. And we need to understand that the flow of services is going to happen in a very natural way. And it's about close monitoring and evaluation and just making sure that everything is being done appropriately. But we cannot control how a Taliban guy selling fruit in a market in his village may get $1 that was originally given by us, funded by a government. So I think we need to understand and accept certain realities. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. Representative Bilirakis has a question, and so I'll now turn this over to him. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Some of you said that you have previously worked with the Taliban. What would you say was the status of religious minorities and faith-based aid workers working under the Taliban? And what do you think their condition will be moving forward with the country under total Taliban control? Whoever would like to begin.
Sure, I can begin. We have many colleagues that work in faith-based organizations across Afghanistan. CRS, Tier Fund, there are many organizations that have worked in Afghanistan even during the last Taliban regime and are staying on the ground and delivering. They follow the same principles that we follow. They have their own access teams. I haven't heard anything in all of the different rumors that are going around about them being targeted. I've literally heard nothing about that, and we hear quite a few rumors. So I don't know if Jared or Astrid have heard anything about that.
No, I would like to add that Taliban, they judge the NGOs on their performance if they are delivering, that we are not perceived as just pushing paper or spending money and there's no results. So there are very few organizations, I think, that would have cause to be worried. When it comes to minorities, that is a bit more uncertain. What I can say is that people of certain minorities are more afraid, it seems to me, than other groups.
So the Afghan citizens who are particularly religious minorities, in particular Christians, do you feel that they are more vulnerable under this regime? I guess you kind of answered that, but if anybody would like to elaborate, I'd appreciate it.
So I would say it's more about the ethnic minorities that I think are more vulnerable. There's an ethnic minority called the Hazaras, which have been persecuted in the 90s under the previous Taliban regime. Yeah. And yeah, they've had very severe attacks on them over the past several years, and they have real cause for concern. That being said, in the provinces where they're predominant, the takeover was actually relatively nonviolent in comparison to other provinces. So there may be an opportunity as part of the Taliban's request for legitimacy to not do any sort of ethnic or religious persecution this time around. But again, it's still early days.
Is there any way, go ahead, please.
I do know that they reached out to the Sikh community in Nangarhar to explicitly tell them that they would be protected, which has always been a persecuted community, particularly by ISK.
Let me ask you a question. This gives you an opportunity to elaborate on all the good work you're doing up to this point. Can you, does someone want to speak to that, the great work that the NGOs are doing and how much progress you've made up to now. I would want to give you the opportunity to do so. Who would like to start on that? Specifically, what the progress you've made in helping the citizens of Afghanistan, whether it's education, what have you.
Okay, this time I volunteer to start. First of all, the life-saving programs that we do is literally saving lives. Afghanistan is a country where you have -degrees in the winter, and if you're living under a tarpaulin, you risk losing your baby, your elderly parents. You basically risk dying from the environment. NRC's shelter programs have provided protection for tens of thousands of Afghan families. Our education programs have ensured that both boys and girls are getting primary education. We have livelihood programs that have been in the tune of $20, $30, $40 million size grants, where a normal beneficiary count is 20,000 families are provided durable solutions in terms of livelihood. Last year alone, during a pandemic, NRC serviced more than 700,000 Afghans, and we are aiming to pass the 1 million mark this year if we can get Taliban to provide the reassurances we need in order to resume our work, namely allow our female staff to come back to work and not only for office work. Over.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that isn't necessarily well known, but 99% of the staff of all NGOs are Afghans. And there's this perception that Afghans need to be helped, but they're helping themselves. They're doing an incredible job. They're taking risks. They're helping develop different government policies, innovations to help the people. I just think that we need to acknowledge the work that they do and the fact that they're going to continue doing that work. They did it under the previous Taliban regime. They did it under the Russians. They did it under extreme conditions, and they're going to continue to do this work. They appreciate any support that the international community can give them, but Afghans are incredibly resilient people.
Thank you for making that point. I appreciate that. Jared, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say very frankly that the NGO community has a degree of legitimacy in Afghanistan that the previous government did not in certain ways. And I think that if you were to go to at a very local level, the Afghan people would rather turn to support from NGOs because they know it's a reliable service with transparency and fairness than sometimes a government agency would not be in a position to provide, or they would not be able to access all of the areas in which the people of Afghanistan live. So NGOs are there, and we have been there, and we'll continue to be there regardless of turnover of regimes. And I think that NGOs are a critical function in that way. I do think that a long-term goal should be for NGOs to be seen less as the key support service and infrastructure of the government, but we need to build upon a government that is transparent and open and fair in order to improve those conditions. So I think basically what I'm saying is that, if corruption, it continues to be a problem in Afghanistan, the need for NGOs will always exist at the level in which the need is there.
Very interesting. Again, I want to thank you for your extraordinary service. Your role is vital to the citizens of Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Representative Bilirakis, thank you so much for your questions. We are now running a little bit over on time, but I would like to just ask the panelists if they want to make any final closing remarks very briefly, particularly as it relates to protection concerns. And I'll start with you, Vicky, and then we'll go to Astrid and Jared. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again for this opportunity. And I just want to make the plea one more time. Let's not forget about the 40 million people that are still in Afghanistan after the end of this month. Thank you.
I would like to make a comment on all the media buzz around was all the effort in the last 20 years a waste of time and a waste of money. I can assure you it's not. I worked here in 2003, and the biggest challenge I had was to find people, hire people who could speak English or who had more than 6 years of education. And now, 20 years later, when we advertise positions, we get people with bachelor degrees, we get people with master degrees, we get more people applying than we can hire, and they're all qualified. And that is such a difference that I would like to tell you guys, it wasn't in waste. And we can still save that part of Afghanistan by not abandoning them in their time of needs.
Yeah, thank you. And we've touched on this in any number of different ways, but I think fundamentally, you cannot have a functioning, thriving, socioeconomic country that functions well without women as part of the backbone of work. And so women need to be able to safely work in this country. They need to have their basic rights ensured and protected. If there's going to be any sort of attempt at legitimacy moving forward. And I think that women's rights are going to be a critical issue. I think women's rights over the past 20 years, it has been one of the major achievements in Afghanistan, and ensuring that that doesn't backslide will be a major, major priority for NGOs, especially the three that are speaking today. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Vicky, Astrid, Jared, so appreciate you joining us, and appreciate your dedication to the cause and to your work, and wish you all the best and safety to you and your staff. I also want to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for hosting this important briefing today, and wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.